Hi, welcome to Innovation Root Studio. I'm your host Noopur, and today I'm really glad to have Miss Emmy Jo Kim with us. Emmy is a social game designer, a community architect, an author, and a startup coach. Hi Emmy, welcome to our studio.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So Emmy, a lot of people know you coming from game thinking, but you do a lot of design thinking and game thinking both. So what is the difference between these two?
That's a great question. So design thinking, as we know, incorporates rapid iteration and empathizing with your customers and figuring out how to build what people want before you've even put it to code. That's very much part of design thinking. Game thinking embraces all of that, but it adds a through line of progress and mastery, which comes from gaming. So there are three key elements of game thinking that go beyond design thinking. One is who you focus on when you empathize with your customers. And game thinking brings a focus on high-need early adopters or superfans. The second difference is game thinking introduces a framework of a path to mastery, which software developers and product creators can use to keep customers engaged over time by helping them get better at something that they care about. And the third element of game thinking that is beyond design thinking is the idea of a learning loop, which is a habit-building loop that you create so that your customers' skills are developed as they engage with your product.
And how would you like to define game thinking for a layman?
Right. Game thinking is the art and science of engaging your customers along a path to mastery.
Well, we know everyone wants to build a product loved by people. So what is your idea about understanding what people want and surprise them by going an extra mile?
That's a wonderful question. So this gets to the things I just talked about. What game thinking brings to software developers is a focus on early, high-need customers. So what we've discovered is that if you try and please everybody and really reach your whole total addressable market, you will fail. Because when you're innovating, you need to first capture and delight your early high-need market before trying to reach the mainstream. And game thinking brings you techniques and a step-by-step process for identifying, empathizing with, and understanding the leading edge of your customers. The reason this is so useful and important is because those customers are a proxy for where the rest of your market, I'll say that again so I don't look at the camera. Those customers are a proxy for where the rest of your market will be in 18 to 24 months. And if you're able to capture and delight that early beachhead market, you then have the opportunity to expand from that beachhead into a larger mainstream market. The way, once you've identified, so step one is to identify a slice of your market, this leading edge slice that acts as a proxy. Once you've identified them, you can understand and study their existing habits and their unmet needs. And game thinking brings a technique for doing that in a step-by-step fashion with certain questions and a certain approach. Then, once you understand the existing habits and the unmet needs of this early market, you can take that and use it to drive your design. The best way to delight and engage customers is to fit in with their lifestyle and their habits, but make it better and take it further.
Do you think the game thinking approach is equally effective for teenage as well as elderly set of audience?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say it's even more effective. So game thinking is taking what makes games deeply engaging over time, the structural elements, not the surface elements, and applying them to any software project. When, as I mentioned, the way that you do this is to first focus in and understand your audience. If you have a teenage audience, it's really about finding a way to reach them and surface their unmet needs. Same thing with elder people. Human beings are motivated by wanting to get better at something they care about. That's a universal human motivation. So it applies to children. We do, with our business, we do a lot of work with children's educational software, reaching children even as young as 6 and 7. We do work reaching teenagers, and we've done some work also reaching elderly people. The challenge comes with how you actually do your outreach in order to understand the audiences. That's really where the differences and the challenges come. The motivation and the power is the same. When you're understanding and speaking to anybody under 18, you need to get the parents' permission. And so that really becomes the challenge, in that you need to engage the parents as well as the children, be it teenagers or younger children, in order to understand them. So we have methodologies for doing that kind of outreach. When it comes to elderly people, you don't have that issue, but the issue you run into is familiarity with technology. The outreach channels that we use to understand and speak to people in their 20s, millennials, and teenagers are often going to be different than the outreach channels we use to reach more elderly people. What we found is that Facebook is very good for reaching elderly people. It's become a platform for older people. Although it started as a platform for college students, it's now largely for elderly people. We also have techniques for reaching out to people right where they are. The key idea is, if you want to find people to understand, go where they hang out, go where they are. So sometimes we will go to an elderly, a home for elderly people, and we'll recruit there. Or we'll run Facebook ads, or we will find an interest group, a gathering, either online or in the physical world, where people gather. It might be a gaming group. For instance, if they're at where I live, I belong to an organization called the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. I'm Jewish. And it's a gym and a club, and it has all ranges of people. So they have a Mahjong club where people come and play Mahjong. And we have sometimes gone there to recruit people to study for a project where we needed elderly people. And what we find is, as long as you are able to find people and identify them by need, the technique works from 8 to 80. And it's really about finding a people who have a burning need for the thing that you're offering. And if you can make that connection, age is irrelevant. It's just about finding an unmet need and then solving that problem with your application or software.
So, Emmy, do you think there is a connect between leadership and creativity, and how it can be an added advantage for a leader?
That's a great question. There's a deep connection between leadership and creativity. The difference between being an individual contributor, working with or for a leader, and being a leader is that as a leader, you really need to lead. The best way to lead, I found, is to lead by example rather than by sternness or instruction. So the challenge with creativity comes when you're leading people who are motivated in different ways. And humans, we all are motivated to get better at something we care about. We all want to be lifted up by our leaders, and we want to become more awesome, become better ourselves. And when you're a leader and you have a team, you might have somebody who's very introverted, and they're not going to speak up in meetings so much. You might have someone else who's very extroverted, and they're going to be jumping at every opportunity. So the creativity comes in figuring out how to make both of those kinds of personalities feel included and feel like their best self is being brought out. What I've found as a team leader is that the way that you structure and set up your meetings makes a huge difference. So most of us, I mean, how many of us hate meetings? You know, people complain about meetings. Oh, my life is full of meetings. You know, I have so many meetings and yet we don't get anything done. So one of the problems with meetings is that they become dominated by certain personalities, say the extrovert. So what I've found is that if you can, one, set up short meetings with a tight agenda, that can help the meetings not be so long. And if you can bring out the introvert, bring out the people who are more shy, you get a much better team dynamic. And the key thing there is fear of failure. And as a leader, to be able to create an environment where people are celebrated for failing, which is very difficult. In school, we're raised to believe you have to do well, don't show weakness, don't fail, or bad things will happen. But in fact, creativity and innovation are all about failing fast. So what I've found is that the extroverted people will often be okay with failure. I mean, nobody likes it, but you know, they just sort of roll with the punches and they keep going. But it's the shy, introverted people who are terrified of failure. And so as a leader, the creativity that has worked for me in making my team empowered is to speak openly about my own failures. Again, to be a role model for failing fast. For instance, I'm going to give a talk here at this conference tomorrow. And one of the key things I'm going to share is some terrible failures that I myself experienced and the mistakes I made, and then what I learned, and sharing that with the other people. And so what I found as a leader is if you can bring that vulnerability to your team and communicate that, even somebody very accomplished and successful like myself became that way by failing, and then really looking at the failure and learning from it. It can be scary to do that at first, but it's the most empowering way to get the most out of your team.
Emmy, according to you, what are the 3 common challenges applying the game thinking approach while developing a product?
I see 3 common challenges. The first is entrepreneurs often will talk to the wrong people when they're building their product, and then they get feedback and information about people that leads them in the wrong direction. So this relates to the idea of superfans, early high-need customers. Many entrepreneurs, they map out their TAM, or total addressable market, TAM. And then they say, okay, I want to reach this big market, big mainstream market. And then they go and talk to people that are very mainstream. And the problem is, when you're innovating, you need to get that beachhead market first. You need to delight and serve your early market before you reach the mainstream. It's just how innovation works. So I see a lot of entrepreneurs talking to and trying to serve the mainstream without realizing that they have to talk to and serve the cutting edge slice of their market first. Mm-hmm. And so that can kill a product. Mm-hmm. And I have lots of stories about that. Yeah. Perhaps I'll tell you one in a moment. Sure. So that's problem number 1. And so the solution to that problem is to find that early adopter, cutting edge slice of your market and talk to them and see what their problems are, not trying to get the mainstream. And so what I tell people is niche down to grow big. Okay? The second problem I see, very common, is they over-polish and over-engineer the prototype. It's very tempting, especially when you're raising money, to make a very beautiful prototype, to make a simple, this is what we want to build, and make the interface and the screens look beautiful and very polished. The problem is that if you do that, 2 things happen. when you're testing it with your early market. One, people will give you different feedback on a very polished looking prototype than they will on something that looks rough, as if it was hand sketched. No matter what you tell your customers, they will respond to your polished prototype as if it's finished. And people don't want to hurt your feelings. And they say, wow, that's really pretty. So a very polished prototype, it can help you raise money, but once you start testing it with your customers, it can give you a false positive. People will say, oh, that looks great, because they're so impressed with the visuals, because they're so pretty. But in fact, you need their feedback on the structure of the experience, not on the pretty visuals. And so that can cause you to build the wrong product. The second problem with polished visuals is that it slows down your development and your iteration. Success and innovation comes, as we know, from both design thinking and game thinking. It comes from rapid iteration. And the simpler your visuals, the faster you can iterate and change. And if you have very polished visuals and your team has poured their energy and love into polishing the visuals, if you get feedback that things aren't right, it takes longer to change the visuals, and emotionally it's harder because you get invested, because your team spent so much time making them. So that's a really common problem, is over polishing your early visuals of your product. So the third challenge, and this is probably the most difficult and tricky one, is building the wrong MVP. MVP stands for minimum viable product. It's a concept from the lean startup movement that also very much is part of design thinking and game thinking, where you start by building something very small and stripped down that has the essence of what you want to test. So in game thinking, we have, as I mentioned earlier, a concept of the path to mastery. And there's 4 stages in the path to mastery. Discovery, where you discover the product. Onboarding, where you learn the ropes. Habit building, which is where you're a regular and now you're just using the product. And mastery, where you have mastered the core systems and you're ready for more. You want to go deeper. Many people build the wrong MVP by focusing on the wrong stage in the customer journey. Many people build a fake landing page, which is a page on the internet that says that the product exists, even if it doesn't, and they want to see if people are interested, if they'll give you their email or their mobile number to get notified about updates. And a fake landing page is great for testing the discovery phase of the journey, which is your marketing message. And if you test your marketing message when you're building a product, that's great because you know people like your marketing message, but it has nothing to do with testing your experience. And people sometimes will fool themselves into thinking they've validated an idea when in fact they've validated their marketing message. That's one common problem with building an MVP. Some people build the MVP during the onboarding phase. They build out the very first time user experience. They say they download the app and they see this, they see that, and then they build that as their minimum viable product. The problem with that is that once people have gone through the onboarding, then what? If there's no habit building, you've just essentially created a leaky bucket. And many of my clients build nice onboarding and they launch the app, they launch the product, but they have no retention. And they waste a lot of money that way and they don't know how to fix it. So building the wrong MVP is very common and it's hard to do it right. What we advocate and what we get great results for is don't look at discovery, don't look at onboarding, look at habit building. You want to build an MVP that represents day 21 of your product, a typical session once you've learned how to use the product. And if you start your development by really understanding and starting to build that habit loop, that learning loop that's going to keep your customer coming back, you have a much better chance of driving long-term engagement. And we call that building engagement from the ground up.
So where do you see game thinking going 5 years down the line?
So the world is changing, and what we're seeing now is a real breaking of trust with users. With Facebook in the United States, people are leaving Facebook, particularly younger people. They don't like the data, that their data is being misused, and they don't trust Facebook. So that's becoming a much bigger issue. We also see that there's a decline of interest in gamification, especially the style of gamification that's manipulative. And so overall, we're seeing a large shift from manipulation and bribery to drive engagement into empowerment, which is what game thinking is all about. So in 5 years, what I expect to see is widespread adoption of game thinking. I think game thinking will be as popular as design thinking. And it will have its ebbs and flows, and it'll be hot and it'll be not. But overall, what we're seeing and what I expect to keep seeing is more and more entrepreneurs, as well as corporate innovators, adopting the tools that empower their customers to become who they want to be, rather than manipulating their customers into taking the behaviors that they want them to do. And so it's a structural approach rather than a sort of micro-manipulation approach where you're nudging people to do things. It's an idea that you're pulling them by their own motivation and desire. And overall, what it really is respect for the customers. I think the challenge of that approach, to be very honest, is that it's much harder to do than to sprinkle some mechanics or sprinkle some rewards on top of a system. But it's really the only way to drive long-term engagement. And so as more and more customers become savvy and trust becomes a much bigger issue, I think we're going to see those tools adopted much more widely.
Yeah, let's see where we have game thinking after 5 years. And thank you, Emmy. Thanks for being with us. It was wonderful having this discussion with you and get to know game thinking, design thinking, and the challenges of applying game thinking. And we are really glad that we could have this discussion with you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.